Hey guys, in this video we're going to build a complete student marks analysis system using Python, Django, Decorators, regular expressions, Bootstrap, sessions, dynamic templates, and request validation. This is not going to be a basic CRUD tutorial. We're going to structure this project more like a real backend application where the validation is separated using decorators. The business logic is going to be in our views. There's going to be reusable utilities which is going to be isolated properly, and session based persistence is used without a database model. So in this project structure, we're not going to make use of SQLite 3. Instead, we're going to make use of sessions to store our data. So along with this, we'll also understand how Django request lifecycle works, how the decorators intercept the request before it comes to the FPV or the function based view in our views, right? We have two FBVs or function based views in this case, and how data flows from the front end to the back end, and how Django internally stores session data using the Django session table. So we're going to run a few commands, and first let me show you the final application. So to run the few commands, we first get into that directory and we activate the environment, and I have to run python manage.py and space migrate so that I can create the migration files, which is going to create and update the tables when necessary. So we got to run this command as and when we need to update our tables, our session tables basically. As I said, we're not going to make use of SQLite 3, so we have a table for session tables which we have to update, and in order to update them we need to run this command. Thereafter we run the server using python manage.py space run server, and we get this URL. So we're going to take this URL and go to the browser, and this is we paste it in the URL form right here, and we get this form, right? And in this form we have to enter the name of the student and the 5 subjects that we can see right here. And after having given the correct input, we're going to get a table right here. So if you don't give the correct input, or you just submit an empty form and you click on save, what's going to happen is we're going to get some validation. So this validation is basically going to come from our decorators, okay, from here. Okay, so we have this validate student function that is going to validate whether the strings that we are passing to the FPV or the function based view is actually valid. So if we're going to send a empty string, so we're going to get a error message back saying that the student name cannot be empty. Okay, even if you put a student name and you leave the marks blank, you're going to get this error message saying that please enter the marks for all subjects, and this is coming from the validate marks portion. So likewise, there are many validation points here, and the decorators is also basically going to check whether the marks is between 0 to 100, and the regular expression which is going to be used here to check whether if you just submit hyphen and fill up all the marks, I don't think it's going to take it because it's not a valid name. So invalid student name, so we cannot just give anything, or even if we just give a space string, that's not going to work. So we have to give something, any letter with a number, or if required, or any strings, right? And when we click on save, it's going to give us a table right here at the bottom. So moving back to the code. So in Django, URL patterns acts as the entry point of the application. Whenever a request comes from the browser, the Django first checks the URL patterns to determine which view function should handle that request. So we have the root route, and that basically handles the homepage URL like the one that we have here. Then we have the clear route, which is basically going to handle the URL used to clear all the stored student session data. So when we click on this clear data, we're going to erase the entire table off from the sessions table. Okay, then we have the name parameter here, which gives a unique identifier to a URL so it can be referenced inside the templates and backend code. So if I go to index.html, here we can see that these names are being used, okay, like clear students, right? So we want to basically clear the session table, right? So we're going to create this So when we click on this, we can literally see on our left bottom side of this screen, when I'm not just clicking on it, I'm just hovering over it, we can see the slash clear right here, and that is basically coming from our URL patterns, right? The name that we have here. So uh, when we click on that, our entire session clears out, right? So then we have the URL mapping, which connects a specific URL path to a specific Django view function, right? So when we click on views, when we click on add student details, it comes to our views, right? And now before writing backend logic, let's first understand what actually happens internally. So the browser sends the request, right? We send some request from the browser, and we're going to receive it from our Django URL router right here, and that is going to send the request to the view function based view, right, the FPV, and we're going to render some template after performing some operations, right? So first we're going to perform some operations that we have in our function based view, and then we're going to render a template, and we're going to make that response and return it back to the server. So our decorators will sit right between our request that is coming from the browser and the function based view, the actual view function. Okay, so this is our decorators right here, and we have two decorators, that is validate student and validate marks, and we have assigned those decorators to one particular function based view. Okay, there are two decorators on one function based view. On our clear students, we don't have any decorator because it is not required in this particular project. Now this is where our request pipeline starts. Now decorators intercept the request before the actual view executes. That means the validation happens before the business logic, and this is a reusable utility function. So as many function based views we have, we can keep using the decorators on based on those FBVs or function based views. So it's reusable, and instead of duplicating subject lists across multiple files, we isolate the reusable uh, logic inside utils.python file right here. Okay, and we can keep using get subjects in our function based view as well as in our decorators, so that we can get the list of the subjects that we need. And this decorator basically wraps the original view function. Okay, so we're going to write it with the symbol @. Now let's understand something very important. When a request comes from the browser, Django does not immediately execute the function based view. Before the actual view executes, Python first checks whether the decorators are attached to it or not, to the function. In our case, we have these decorators, which means the request must first pass through the validation layers that we have on our right side before the view logic is allowed to run. So a decorator is what? Basically, it's a higher order function, which means a function that accepts another function with some adds some extra behavior and returns a modified function. So in our decorator valid student, we have view function argument. Now this view function is actually our original Django view. So execution order becomes first validation student executes, that is this function, the first one. Then validate marks executes, the second decorator. And finally the add student details function based view executes. So inside a decorator, we have this wrapper function. So the wrapper function becomes the new function Django actually executes in our decorator. So technically Django is no longer calling the add student details directly. Instead, Django calls the wrapper function, and wrapper decides whether the original view, the F function based view FBV, should execute or not. So inside this wrapper function, we decide whether the function based view is actually going to execute or not. And Python internally rewrites these decorators in, I think, somewhat this manner. So we're giving a call to validate student, the decorator, and inside validate student we are passing view function. So view function is our actual FBV or our function based view. So that's going to be our add student details. But before we actually go for add student details, we also have another decorator called validate marks. So inside validate student, which is going to be executed first, the second one that is going to execute is validate marks. So inside validate student, we're going to have validate marks, and inside validate marks, we're going to have our actual function based view. So this is how the calls are going to be made. So first validate student, that is the first decorator that we have, is going to be executed. Then the validate marks, the second decorator, and then finally the add student details, which is our function based view. Now in our decorators, we are passing the view function, the function based view, that is add student details, as an argument, which is an object, and we are also returning an object which is the view function that contains the add student details function, the function based view. Now inside the wrapper function, we are writing an argument. It takes an argument as a request and returns an object as a function, right? Now the context is what we have to send always when subjects and students list is concerned. So say supposing we have a table here and we have passed some data, and say it doesn't match, so it passes through the decorator, the validation part, and say after the validation it sends the student name cannot be empty. Okay, so we cannot just send this, otherwise when we have some data on the table and it sends that validation, then only that validation will show, right, and the rest of the table will disappear. So we don't want that to happen, so we send the subjects and the students list with inside the context, and we just update the context in this manner. Okay, and when we are requesting a post method, right, when we are sending some data from the browser to our function based view via the URLs, we are basically going to check. So what's happening here is when the data comes to the URLs and finally to the function based view, is going to realize that it has some decorators. So when it goes, when that value passes through the decorators, that means directly when we are providing an check statement that if the user has entered something through the browser, then we want to receive or get that request or get that value from that request called student name. Okay, and we receive that in request.student name. So we are using using the request to store the student name so that we can use it in our function based view directly. Another way of doing it is passing the student name inside the view function as an argument. So instead of sending it as an extra argument, why not just send it with the request, and it's completely safe, right? Then after that we just write that the request.student name is equals to student name. Now we can use the name of the student as the variable inside our decorator. Now what we do with the student name is we just check if it is an empty string, and if it is, then we just pass this string value which says student name cannot be empty, and also the alert type. So in our index.html, I have mentioned the alert type as well, so we can change our inline CSS as well, okay, via the Python arguments. Now we update the context like we have here, and we pass that via the render function that is going to render our HTML DOM element. Okay, and with that the request as well. So when we send the request, we are passing it to the function based view, and we are receiving the student name that we have here from the request. Okay, that we are doing it from student name right here. Okay, we are receiving the student name from the request as well as the student marks. And notice here that I have only written this line, the statement that request.post.get student name only in the decorator. We are not writing the same thing again in our function based view, although we can, but why do things twice when you can only call it once, when you can just receive it once and pass that value to the request and receive it right here. It's more convenient, right? Thereafter we have the students list. Instead of writing this so many times, I think what I'm going to do is just remove this because we already have context right here, right? And instead of writing so much, we're just going to write this, which is going to be of type list equals to this, and we are going to copy the rest, paste it here. Now what this line can be read as, what it means is it fetches the value stored under the key students list from the current user session. So session has a key, it's a dictionary, and it has a key called students list, and it fetches the data from that student list key. And if that is does not exist, if that's not there, then it just returns an empty list. And we are updating the students list inside the context. And thereafter we have a pattern which includes all lowercase and uppercase letters, and including a space in a name. And that pattern is going to check if using the match function that we get from the regular expression that we import right here, and it's going to check using the pattern from that student's name. And if it is invalid, then it just passes the string value in and renders our template, right? We just update the context with this string value, and we pass on the remaining data as well, the students list as well as all the subjects, and the updated message with the alert type. And this danger is basically uh, doing the colors for Bootstrap, right? So if I just go to Google Chrome and open Bootstrap, I think it's in examples, or just type danger, or just go to buttons instead. From there we can find, right? So we have the color called success, okay, then we have danger right here. So like that we can have multiple colors. So I'm just changing the color for what we have in our alert box. Okay, so I think it's alert, so it's like that, alert success. Okay, so you can just change, you can make this data dynamic. So coming back to our decorators, thereafter we just update this context and we send it to the template. uh, then we check if there are any students in the students list. Then we just check if we loop through the students in that entire students list, and for each student we check if the name matches the name that is already existing in that table. Okay, we are checking for duplicates, and if it does match, then we just send a string value that this particular student's name is already there in that table along with that alert type. Then we render the template with the context that we are updating back to the uh, DOM element. All right. Then next decorator that we have is validation of marks. Now in this validation of marks, we are doing the same thing with the context. We are setting out a context that subjects and students list is something that we have to render, and thereafter we actually, this line isn't required, so I'm just going to remove it. And now we have if request method is post, right? So if the browser is sending us some sort of data, then we are going to receive it in our decorators via urls.py, and using that data we initialize student marks, and we're going to use that student marks for appending all the marks that we have in a particular list. All right, because that was our original intention, right, in this list. So in student marks, we're going to first iterate through the request post items. Right now, post is a query dictionary, right? It's a query dictionary where when we have a dictionary that we want to query, and we're going to receive from that dictionary keys and values. So when we want both, when we want access to both, we just use the items like we use for every other ordinary dictionary. And when we have access to key and value, we're going to use that key and value for checking whether marks that is in this particular field, if it starts with marks underscore 1 or marks underscore 2, because that is the format that we have given, right? And like say supposing in index, I think it's Right, we are looping through the counters, right? And we're going to write this particular string that we have. So it's going to loop through all the marks that we have. Now, instead of having multiple div elements, we have just written one div element and we're just looping through all the subjects. So for each time we are passing a value in our input fields right here, we're going to pass 5 and it's going to receive 5 for as many uh, counters it comes across. Okay, and here we're going to strip that value. Strip meaning the strip function, what it does is just removes the spaces from the beginning and the end of the string, and it checks if it is empty or not. So that's the validation that we put for marks. So if we put something like put a space right here, and it's not receiving a space because the type I think is number, so the input type is number, so it doesn't the input that is type number does not accept any spaces. So if there were any spaces, then it would just strip that value off. So in this case I don't think strip is required, but this is further validation, so I'm just going to keep it there. And we have an alert type, and we're going to render that HTML page with the context that we have after updating it. Now inside the try block, we have checked that we first convert the value that we have that we receive from the index HTML page from this value, right? You are using this name marks 1 or 2 or 3 in that syntax, and we receive that in mark. Now we use that marks to validate if it is between 0 to 100, and if we provide that correct one, then everything's fine. We just append that to student marks list. Otherwise we just raise a value error, and that value error is basically going to check and send back a updated context message saying that it needs to be between the marks needs to be between 0 to 100, and we just render that HTML page via that request. And finally, when we have all the marks, we put append or assign those student marks that we have, which is the collection of all the 5 marks that we have, and we assign it to request student marks. Now this request student marks is what we receive in our function based view, and finally we return from that view function. So when we come to our function based view, the control is going to come here, and that request is basically going to check that we have stored whether we have stored that students list or not. So if we have stored, then it's going to assign that students list into students list variable. Otherwise it's just going to return an empty list. And first thing, it's going to check that the guest request is basically responsible for rendering the initial page. So when I enter this URL right here and I click on this initially, this page that we see that is being rendered on our browser is via our get method. So that's responsible for rendering the initial page. And initially we write the context with the students list and all the subjects that we get from our utility file, and we render that along with the context and the request. Now say if we had a post method, that is the browser sending some data via this form, and we receive it right here. Now notice that we haven't taken this as request post get. We're just writing request student name because we have already received that name as well as the marks right here, right? And we're going to use that marks and from our request as a dictionary. So we're going to use our request and we're going to assign it to student name and marks. And now I'm going to check with using those marks for the average, the total, as well as the grade. Okay, now in our total we just check that we find the length of our student marks, that is we have 5 subjects, right? So student marks is a list of 5 elements, so it's going to find the length of that list. So the length of the list is going to be 5. So we divide the total, which is the summation of the student marks, on 500, because it's between 0 to 100. So max it can reach up to 500. So 500 divided by the length of the student marks, which is 5. So that's going to be 100. That's max, and 0 it's at its lowest. And if this is incorrect, say if anything goes wrong, then we have the zero division error, right? Because say supposing if total is something and our list is empty, so whatever the total is going to sum it up. But if our list is empty and the length of that list is going to be 0, we have an exception for that, and that exception I use as zero division error. So in case that is what we get, we send the average as 0, which is a float type. Okay, and then we check the grade. So if it is less than 50, we do fail, and the rest for grades A, B, and C. And this is a structure that we give to the student dictionary called student data. We pass the name, the marks, the total, average, and grade, and we have a table that here that we display all the data. And this is basically where we assign that students list to the session. So finally, when it comes here, when we pass the data and it comes via the function base view and it realizes that it has a decorator, it comes through here and it checks. Initially what happens is it's going to return an empty list, right? Because we haven't stored anything yet. So initially it's going to be an empty list, and finally when we're going to send some data, it's going to store that data using the request session. Okay, and the context that we have, the updated context, is going to be in this format. So we're going to pass this students list, we're going to pass all the subjects that we have right here. Okay, and we're going to pass a successful message as well as the color of the alert box. So if I enter some data into it, I'll just put in my name with a space as well, and say if I put in 3 digits, which is invalid, right? And like that, click save. Marks must be between 0 to 100, so it definitely must have passed through that decorator. Now say if I enter the correct name and all the correct marks and click save, then we get the alert type that students, it's a success message, and we have the name, the marks, the list of marks that we have for each subject, and the total that has been calculated, all the performance, all the operations that have been performed, right? The total, average, and the grade. Okay, I don't think this is going to take that either, because it also checks for duplicates already exists. So I'm going to put a different name. Alright, that's been added. So that is what the value of space does. Okay, for checking if there are any spaces that is going to be allowed in that string or not. And finally we come to the clear data button, that is basically our flush session flush function, and that function basically flushes the current Django session, removing all the stored session data for the user, then redirects to the root URL, right, which is our index.html, right? So if I click on this clear data, our entire table is going to be wiped out, cleared out, right? So that brings us to the end of this tutorial. In this project, we learned how to build a complete Django application using function-based views, custom decorators, using regular expression validation, session storage, dynamic template rendering, Bootstrap UI, right, and clean backend architecture patterns. More importantly, we understood the actual request lifecycle in Django and how decorators intercept and validate requests before business logic executes, or before it comes to the request comes to the function based view, right? And if you found this tutorial valuable, I highly recommend rebuilding this project on your own and experimenting it with additional features like edit and delete. Till then, keep practicing, keep building, and I'll see you guys in the next one.